Before we begin, make sure you're somewhere comfortable. Maybe even turn the lights off. And if you enjoy real horror stories like this, hit subscribe, because these only get darker the deeper you go. In the house where I grew up, there were a few things that happened that I never really understood. At the time, I didn't think too deeply about them. I was young, and when something felt strange or uncomfortable, I usually just avoided it and moved on. But looking back now, especially after talking about it years later, those moments feel a lot more unsettling than they did back then. The first thing I remember clearly is something that used to happen when I came home from school. I was probably around 8 to 10 years old at the time, and there would often be a short period where I was home alone before my parents got back. It was usually quiet, just the normal sounds of a house settling, maybe a faint noise from outside. Nothing unusual. But every now and then, I would hear music. It wasn't loud. Oh, and it wasn't coming from anything I could see. It sounded like a flute, playing a soft, simple melody. The kind of sound that felt calm at first, but the more you listened to it, the stranger it became. It didn't sound like a recording or something coming from a TV or radio. It felt distant, but also close at the same time, like it was somewhere in the house but not in any specific room. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe it was coming from outside, maybe a neighbor, even though that didn't really make sense. I never heard any of my neighbors play instruments, and the sound didn't feel like it was traveling through walls or from another house. It felt like it was just there, existing on its own. The more it happened, the more it started to bother me. I wouldn't stick around to listen for long. As soon as I noticed it, I'd feel this quiet sense of unease, like something wasn't right. I wouldn't panic or run, but I'd leave the house and go outside instead. I'd grab my hockey stick and just play around in the yard or the street, anything to keep myself distracted until one of my parents came home. After a while, I stopped thinking about it. It became one of those things that happened a few times and then faded into the background of my childhood memories. I didn't question it, didn't try to figure it out. I just moved on. Years later, though, that memory came back in a way I didn't expect. I was talking to my older sister about the house. She's about 10 years older than me, so she had her own experiences growing up there, ones I wasn't always around for. We were just casually remembering things, sharing stories. When she mentioned that she always found the house a little creepy, that caught my attention. I asked her what she meant, expecting something simple, maybe just the way old houses can feel at night. But then she told me something that made me pause. She said that sometimes, when she was alone in the house, she would hear a flute melody. For a moment, I didn't even know what to say. I hadn't mentioned anything about my own experiences yet, so hearing her describe the exact same thing felt strange. It wasn't like she was guessing or saying something vague. She described it in a way that matched what I remembered almost perfectly. That conversation stuck with me. It turned something I had mostly forgotten into something harder to ignore. It wasn't just a random childhood memory anymore. It was something we had both experienced separately, without knowing the other had gone through the same thing. The second thing that stands out from that house happened upstairs. The layout was pretty simple, but also a little unusual. There was a staircase that went up in a U shape, leading to a small hallway at the top, maybe around 12 feet long. On one side of the hallway was my parents' bedroom, and on the other side was mine. I didn't spend as much time upstairs after a certain point. When I was around 8, my sister moved out for college, and my bedroom was moved downstairs. But before that, and even a few times after, there were moments on those stairs and in that hallway that I still remember clearly. It always started the same way. I'd walk up the stairs and reach the top where the light switch was. Sometimes when I flipped the switch, the light wouldn't stay on. It would flash for a split second and then go out immediately. It's something that happens sometimes with faulty bulbs or wiring, so it wasn't completely unusual on its own. But during that brief flash of light, I would see something. It wasn't detailed, and it only lasted for that instant when the light came on and then died. But in that moment, I was sure I saw a figure sitting on the edge of my parents' bed. The figure was always facing the wall, never moving, never reacting. It wasn't clear enough to make out features, more like a shape, something that stood out just enough to be noticeable, but not enough to fully understand. The first time it happened, I froze. I remember just standing there, trying to process what I had seen, wondering if my eyes had played a trick on me. When the light went out again, everything was dark, and there was nothing to confirm what I thought I saw. I told myself it was nothing, just a result of the sudden flash of light, maybe my brain filling in shapes where there weren't any. But it happened again, and then again. In total, it happened 4 times over the years I lived there. Each time was the same situation, the light flashing on and off, and in that brief moment, the same kind of figure appearing in the same place. The 4th time was different, though. I was around 11 years old, and when the light flashed, the figure wasn't sitting anymore. It was standing, and it wasn't facing the wall. It was facing me. That was the only time it ever changed, and it was enough to leave a stronger impression than the others. Even though it only lasted for a split second, that image stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. After that, nothing else like that happened again. Not long after my parents divorced and we moved out of the house. That chapter of my life ended, and with it, those strange experiences. When I think back on it now, I try to approach it logically. The flute music could have had some kind of explanation, maybe something carrying through the air in a way I didn't understand at the time. The figure I saw during the light flashes could have been an optical illusion, my eyes reacting to sudden light in a dark space and creating shapes that weren't really there. I don't consider myself someone who believes in ghosts or anything like that. I prefer explanations that make sense, even if I don't fully understand them right away. But even with that mindset, I can't completely ignore how those moments felt. The consistency of the flute music, or the fact that my sister experienced it too, the repeated image of that figure in the same place over the years, it all adds up to something that feels harder to dismiss completely. Maybe it was all just random coincidence, a mix of imagination, lighting, and sound playing tricks on us at different times. That's probably the most reasonable explanation. Still, every now and then, I think about that house and those small, quiet moments that didn't quite fit. And even if I don't believe in anything supernatural, I can admit that some things don't always feel as simple as they should. This happened back when I was in high school, and it's one of those moments that didn't feel scary in the usual way, but still left me with a strange, uneasy feeling that I've never been able to fully explain. Even now, when I think about it, I don't know if it was coincidence, something emotional, or something else entirely. At the time, my friend Joe and I spent a lot of time hanging out together, usually at his house. One thing that always made it more fun was when his older sister came home from college. She was one of those people who was just naturally easy to be around. Even when we were younger, she never treated us like annoying kids. She'd talk to us like we were equals, joke around. and sometimes even take us out late at night to grab snacks or just drive around. So, when she came home to visit that weekend, we were excited. Oh, it felt like things were going to be more interesting than usual. That night, we were all just hanging out at their house, talking, laughing, and passing the time without really paying attention to how late it was getting. Eventually, it got to the point where I needed to head home. Without hesitation, she offered to drive me. It wasn't unusual for her to do that, and honestly, I preferred it. The drive to my house was about 30 minutes, and at that hour, the roads were quiet and dark. It felt like one of those calm, late-night drives where everything is still and peaceful. Joe came along for the ride too, and at first, everything felt completely normal. We were talking, joking around, nothing out of the ordinary, the kind of conversation you don't even think about because it's so natural. As we got closer to my neighborhood, the streets became more familiar, and I started giving her directions. It was fully dark by then. The street lights were spaced far apart, and most of the houses had their lights off. My neighborhood always felt a little quieter than most at night, almost too quiet sometimes, but I never really thought much of it before. As we approached the turn onto my street, I was already getting ready to point it out, but before I could say anything, something felt off. Instead of slowing down or preparing to turn, she just kept driving straight. At first, I thought maybe she didn't hear me or didn't realize the turn was coming up. I spoke up and told her she had missed it. Joe said the same thing, trying to get her attention, but she didn't respond. That's when things started to feel strange. She didn't say anything at all, not even a simple, "Oh, am I bad?" or any kind of acknowledgement. She just kept driving forward, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. I looked at her more closely, expecting to see some kind of reaction, but her face was completely blank. There was no expression, no sign that she'd even heard us. It was like she was there physically, but mentally somewhere else entirely. Joe and I exchanged a quick glance, both of us clearly confused. We tried again, a little more urgently this time, telling her she had missed the turn and needed to go back. But again, nothing. She just kept driving. At that point, the mood in the car shifted. The light, easy feeling from earlier was gone, replaced by something heavier. There was a quiet tension that started to build as we realized she wasn't just distracted. She was completely unresponsive. She drove like that for about a minute, maybe a little longer. It felt longer than it probably was because of how uncomfortable it had become. Neither of us knew what to say or do. We were just sitting there, watching her drive in silence, trying to understand what was happening. Then, without warning, she slowed down and made a turn. It wasn't a random turn. It was into the small cemetery near my house. The moment the car turned in, my stomach dropped. That cemetery was something I had passed countless times, but never at night, and never like this. It was small, surrounded by trees, and barely lit. At that hour, it looked completely dark, almost like a place that didn't belong to the rest of the neighborhood. She pulled the car to a stop and immediately opened the door. Joe and I just sat there for a second, stunned. Neither of us said anything. We just watched as she stepped out of the car and started walking into the cemetery. There was something about the way she moved that made it even more unsettling. She wasn't hesitant or unsure. She walked with purpose, like she knew exactly where she was going. By that point, it was really dark, the kind of dark where shapes blur together and everything looks unfamiliar. Joe and I were both freaking out, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. We just sat there, watching her figure move farther away from the car. She kept walking deeper into the cemetery until she suddenly stopped. She stood in front of a single grave. from where we were, we couldn't see what was written on it. All we could see was her standing there, completely still. For a moment, neither of us moved. It felt like we were waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. She just stood there. Finally, we got out of the car. We walked toward her slowly, unsure of what we were going to find or what we were even supposed to say. The closer we got, the more real everything felt. The quiet, the darkness, the strange situation we had just witnessed, it all pressed in around us. When we reached her, we realized she was crying. That caught both of us off guard. The blank expression she had while driving was gone, replaced by something raw and emotional. She wasn't just tearing up a little. She was genuinely upset, standing there in front of that grave like she had been carrying something heavy for a long time. We asked her what was going on, trying to understand why she had brought us there and why she had acted the way she did. What she told us made everything even harder to explain. The grave she had stopped at belonged to her best friend from middle school and high school. Her friend had died not long before in a dirt bike accident. It had been sudden and tragic. At the time it happened, she was away at college, and because of that, she hadn't been able to attend the funeral. She told us she had never known where her friend was buried. No one had told her, or maybe she just hadn't asked. Either way, she had no idea that this cemetery, the one near my house, was where her friend had been laid to rest. And yet somehow she had driven straight to it. She explained that while she was driving, she suddenly felt this overwhelming urge to keep going. Not to turn onto my street, not to stop, just to keep driving forward. She couldn't explain it. It wasn't a thought or a decision. It was more like a feeling that took over, something she couldn't ignore. Then, just as suddenly, she felt like she needed to turn into the cemetery. And once she was there, she knew exactly where to go. Listening to her, standing there in the dark, looking at that grave, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. There was no way she could have known. She had never been to my house before, never seen that cemetery, never been told where her friend was buried. Joe and I looked at each other again, but this time neither of us even tried to come up with an explanation. Could she have been messing with us? Maybe, but it didn't feel like that. There was no hint of a joke, no sign that she was trying to scare us. The way she cried, the way she spoke, it all felt real. We stayed there for a while, just standing with her in silence. The fear we had felt earlier faded into something else, something quieter and harder to describe. It wasn't just creepy anymore. It felt personal, like we had witnessed something we weren't supposed to fully understand. Eventually we went back to the car and she drove me home like nothing had happened, but the atmosphere had changed. None of us really talked on the way back. To this day, I still think about that night. I don't know what it was that guided her there. I don't know how she found that exact grave without ever knowing it was there. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe it was something emotional buried deep in her mind, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that I was there, I saw it happen, and I still don't have an explanation. This all happened this past summer, and it's something I still can't shake off. My dad owns a 28-foot boat that we've had for about 10 years. It's a decent-sized boat, not massive, but big enough to feel like a tiny floating apartment. Underneath the deck, there's a small cabin that has pretty much everything you'd need for a short stay. A fridge, a microwave, a sink, a bathroom, and even a bed. Over the years, I've spent a lot of nights there, sometimes bringing girlfriends along, drinking, smoking, and just hanging out until we fall asleep in the cabin. It's always been fun, a little escape from everything on land. One night, after a few drinks and smoking on the bow while staring at the river, my girlfriend at the time and I decided to head down to the cabin. We wanted to relax, make some bagel bites in the microwave, and just lie back for a while. The marina where we keep the boat is along the Hudson River and can hold about 50 boats of all shapes and sizes. On most nights, you see at least one other person staying overnight on their boat. Usually there's a guy who parks his old black BMW in the lot and stays close by. But that night, his car wasn't there. For some reason, we were completely alone on the river. It was around 12:30 a.m. when I first noticed something strange. I thought I heard footsteps on the dock. Normally, this wouldn't bother me. You can hear almost anything moving around at night, and it's usually nothing. My first thought was that it might be the BMW guy coming back to his boat, even though his car wasn't in the lot. The footsteps, however, didn't stop at his boat. They started heading toward ours. At first, I assumed maybe some friends had shown up unexpectedly to hang out or smoke, so I didn't worry too much. But then things got really unsettling. The sound of the footsteps continued and seemed to move directly onto the bow of our boat. That in itself was weird, because normally, if someone were climbing onto the boat from the dock, you'd hear some scraping, some sound of the railing, or steps. But these footsteps were smooth, almost silent, like whoever, or whatever it was, simply glided from the dock onto the boat without a single misstep. The steps stopped right at the porthole above the bed, where my girlfriend and I were lying down, staring up at the stars through the small opening. And then it just stopped. I didn't hear a voice. I didn't hear anything like someone trying to talk to us or sit down. All I saw was a face pressed against the glass. My heart practically stopped. Without thinking, I swung my fist at it, but the face disappeared instantly. What I saw has haunted me ever since. It had no eyes, just smooth, empty sockets where the eyes should have been, and a smile that was wrong in every way. It wasn't natural. I've smoked and drank enough in my life to know what hallucinations feel like, and this wasn't that. I knew it was real. The glass didn't break, thankfully, but the fear in that moment was like nothing I've ever felt. My girlfriend and I were frozen, staring at where the face had been, and the strangest, most horrifying part was the silence afterward. There were no footsteps retreating back to the dock, no sound of someone leaving, nothing. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, leaving only the darkness behind. I jumped up, flipping on every floodlight and spare light on the boat, grabbed my dad's fillet knife, and went outside to check. There was nothing. No person, no animal, no black BMW guy. Nothing but our car in the empty parking lot. I told my dad about it later, hoping for some comfort, but he just laughed and shook his head. He didn't take it seriously, saying I probably imagined it or had too much to drink. I still spend nights on the boat because it's fun, and I love being out on the river, but that night stayed with me. It wasn't just a prank or a weird dream, it was something else, something I can't explain. Not long after that, something else happened that added to the sense that the marina wasn't as normal as it seemed. I was there with a different girl, and we were lying in the cabin, getting ready to fall asleep. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in from every direction when the water is still. Out of nowhere, she muttered, "There's something here with us." I sat straight up, startled. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. She blinked at me, clearly confused, and admitted she had no idea what she had just said. That moment was enough to make me stop dismissing everything as random or imagined. After that, I became convinced that the marina had something strange about it. It wasn't just the empty-eyed face or the sudden awareness my girlfriend had of something in the room. It was the feeling that the place held a presence, something that watched and moved when we weren't looking. On nights when the marina is empty, when the river is still, and when the lights are off, you can feel it. The wind seems to carry whispers that aren't really there, and shadows move in ways that shouldn't be possible. I've spent enough nights alone on that boat to notice small things that don't add up. Sometimes I hear the faint creak of footsteps on the dock, even when I know nobody is around. Other times, I wake to the feeling of being watched through the porthole, even though I can see nothing outside. The river itself seems quiet, almost too quiet, as if it's holding its breath. Even writing about it now, I can remember the fear, the complete disbelief that turned into instinctive action. I grabbed that knife, ran outside, turned on every light, but nothing was ever there. And yet the memory of that face with empty eye sockets and a twisted smile comes back in flashes, more vivid than any dream or hallucination I've ever had. And the way it just appeared and vanished without a sound, that's what sticks. I still go to the boat. I still bring friends and spend nights on the water, but now I'm more careful. I make sure to lock the doors, leave lights on, and pay attention to sounds that used to seem normal. The night I saw the face changed how I see that marina, the river, and even my own safety. I can't explain what it was, and I don't pretend to understand, but I know one thing: something was there, and it was watching us. And that's why every time I go back to the boat, even in broad daylight, I feel a little tension, a little unease. Because I know that night wasn't just a fluke. That night proved that the marina, quiet and peaceful as it seems, isn't always empty. There are things there that we don't see, things that move without sound, and things that can appear in an instant and vanish just as fast. I can't say why it happened or what it wanted, but I will never forget it. The boat itself feels different now, even though it's the same boat I've loved for years. The cabin, once just a cozy place to hang out and eat snacks, now feels a little smaller, a little more closed in. Every shadow seems to linger longer, every sound carries more weight. My girlfriends notice it too. They feel it the instant they step aboard. That same subtle pressure, like someone or something is right there with us, just out of reach, watching. Even after everything, I still go to the boat. I can't stop loving it. The water is too peaceful, the night's too beautiful. But I never forget that night. I never forget the face, and I never forget the way it just vanished, leaving nothing behind but the echo of fear and the knowledge that the marina isn't as empty as it seems. When I worked overnight security at one of the largest and oldest hospitals in the country, I quickly learned that some buildings carry a different kind of atmosphere once the sun goes down. During the day, everything feels normal, busy, loud, full of people moving with purpose. But at night, especially in certain older parts of the hospital, it feels like you're walking through a completely different place. There was one building in particular that everyone talked about. Even before I had my own experience, I had already heard stories from other officers. Most of them laughed it off during conversations, but there was always something in the way they told those stories that made you think they weren't entirely joking. That building had a long history. It was originally built in the late 1800s and used as a psychiatric facility. Back then, mental health wasn't understood the way it is today, and this hospital was heavily involved in medical research. When you put those two facts together, it doesn't take much imagination to realize that some of the treatments and experiments carried out there were probably harsh, even cruel. Over time, the hospital expanded, and a newer psychiatric ward was built elsewhere. The old building was eventually converted into office space. By the time I started working there, it was technically just another office building. But at night, it was completely empty. The people who worked there left right at the end of the day, sometimes even earlier, and by the time my shift started, the place was always silent. Part of my job during night rounds was to check every office door. If someone had left their door unlocked, I had to secure it. Well, it sounds simple, but in a building like that, it meant walking through long, narrow hallways, floor by floor, checking door after door in complete silence. One night, I was assigned to that building. I had already heard the stories, but I didn't really believe them. I figured it was just people messing with the new guy or letting their imagination get the better of them. I started with my usual routine. First, I did a full sweep of the building to make sure no one was inside. That part was important. Once I confirmed it was empty, I began checking the doors. The layout made it easy in a way, since the hallways were narrow enough that I could check both sides as I walked. At the end of one hallway, there was a dead-end office. To get to it, you had to pass through two separate sets of doors. It felt more isolated than the rest of the building, like it was tucked away from everything else. I checked that final office, made sure everything was secure, and then turned around to head back. I pushed through the two sets of doors and stepped into the hallway again. And then I stopped, completely froze. Every single door along the hallway was open, not just slightly open, not randomly left that way. Each one was positioned just enough that it wouldn't swing shut on its own. It looked deliberate, like they had all been set that way at the same time. At the far end of the hallway, there was a wheelchair. It was facing toward the stairs, sitting there in the middle of the corridor, like it had been placed there for a reason. A few seconds earlier, I had walked that same hallway. Every door had been closed and secured. I knew that for a fact, because I'd just checked them myself. There was no sound, no footsteps, no movement, nothing that would suggest someone had come through and done that. That was the moment everything I had heard from the other officers stopped sounding like jokes. I didn't stick around any longer than I had to. I finished what I needed to do and got out of there. After that night, I never volunteered for those rounds again. That building wasn't the only place with strange activity, though. Another area we had to patrol was an old children's ICU that was under construction. It was being converted into medical labs, so our job was to make sure everything stayed secure and that no one was inside after hours, except for the occasional contractor working late. There had been stories going around about that place too, as several officers claimed they had seen a young boy wandering around, always described the same way, around 5 to 7 years old, short brown hair, kind of like an old bowl cut. I didn't believe any of it at the time. It sounded like something people made up to mess with the new guy. One night, I got assigned to patrol that area. While I was making my rounds, a foreman called security and said there was a kid locked in one of the rooms. He sounded concerned, saying he didn't want the kid getting hurt with all the exposed wiring and construction hazards. So I went to check it out. I unlocked the door and went inside. The room wasn't very big, maybe 10 by 8 feet. I searched the entire space carefully, taking my time to make sure I didn't miss anything. There was no one there, no kid, no movement, nothing out of place. Now, I reported it as a false alarm and continued with my patrol, but I couldn't ignore the fact that the call had sounded genuine. The foreman wasn't joking around. He really believed there was someone in that room. Another night, I was assigned to sit with a psychiatric patient along with another officer. It was what we called a special detail, basically staying in the room to make sure the patient didn't harm themselves or anyone else. At some point during the night, the patient woke up. He looked at the other officer, recognized him, and calmly said hello. Then he looked at me, and his entire demeanor changed. He started screaming, telling me not to hurt him. Now I'm a big guy, and I understand that I can come across as intimidating, especially in that kind of environment. But I always tried to keep my distance and not escalate situations. Still, he was terrified of me for reasons I couldn't understand. He kept repeating that if I promised not to hurt him, he would make something good happen for me. I told him I wouldn't hurt him. After that, he calmed down almost immediately and went back to sleep. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the next day, I was given a permanent set of rounds and a solid promotion. It was probably just a coincidence, but the timing stuck with me. The last story is one that didn't happen to me directly, but I trust the person it happened to. He's actually my roommate now, and he still hates talking about it. He had rounds in that same old psychiatric building. At some point during his patrol, he called over the radio asking for backup. His voice was completely different from usual. It sounded strained, panicked, like he was barely holding it together. I was nearby, so I responded and headed over. When I got there, I found him sitting on the floor with his head between his knees, quietly crying. A shattered chandelier was lying a few feet away from him. After he calmed down a bit, he told me what happened. He said something held him in place. Not physically in a way he could see, but he couldn't move. While he was stuck there, the chandelier above him started swinging harder and harder, like something was pushing it. Then it broke loose. Right before it fell, whatever was holding him there let go. He was able to move just in time to get out of the way. We got him out of there and brought him to the supervisor. When she heard what happened, she yelled across the room to another supervisor, saying they had almost lost another one in that building. The other supervisor just laughed and said that was why they always sent the new guys there. He even admitted he didn't like going into that building himself. Hearing that made it clear that these weren't isolated stories. People had experienced things there before, enough that it became part of the culture of the job. I'm not someone who easily jumps to supernatural conclusions. I still think there are probably explanations for most of what happened, even if I don't fully understand them. Old buildings make noises, lighting can play tricks on your eyes, and stressful environments can affect how people perceive things. But at the same time, there are moments, like that hallway with all the doors open, or the wheelchair sitting there in complete silence, that don't fit neatly into those explanations. Working there taught me something simple. Some places feel different for a reason, even if you can't explain why. And sometimes it's better not to go looking too hard for answers. A couple of years ago, I had an experience that still sits in the back of my mind, even now. It wasn't something dramatic or loud or chaotic. In fact, it was quiet, simple, and over in just a few seconds. But sometimes those are the moments that stay with you the longest, the ones you can't fully explain no matter how many times you think about them. At the time, I was driving home from my girlfriend's house. She's my wife now. But back then it was just a normal routine for me. I'd spend the evening at her place, hang out for a while, and then make the drive back home late at night. That particular night, it was probably around midnight. I remember that clearly because the roads were empty and everything had that still, late-night feeling where the world seems to slow down. I want to make one thing clear. because it matters. I wasn't tired. I'm someone who naturally stays up late, so being on the road at that hour wasn't unusual for me. I was fully awake, alert, and paying attention to everything around me. There was no drowsiness, no drifting thoughts, nothing that would make me question my awareness. The drive itself was familiar. I had taken that same route so many times that I could probably do it without thinking. It was mostly quiet suburban roads with long stretches of darkness in between streetlights. There weren't many cars out at that hour, and the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the occasional noise of tires rolling over the pavement. There was one part of the drive that always stood out, though. Along the way, there was this fairly large house set back from the road, surrounded by a huge open yard. It wasn't fenced in, just a wide stretch of land that extended out into the darkness. During the day, it looked like a normal property, maybe even a nice one. But at night, it felt different. The size of the yard made it feel empty in a way that was hard to explain, like there was too much space and not enough light. As I approached that house, my headlights swept across part of the yard, lighting up the grass in a narrow beam while leaving everything else in shadow. That's when I saw it. Just outside the full reach of my headlights, right at the edge where light fades into darkness, there was a shape. At first, I couldn't quite process what I was looking at. My brain tried to make sense of it, to fit it into something familiar, but it didn't match anything that made sense. It looked like a dog, but not like any dog I had ever seen before. It was massive. Not just big, but unnaturally big. The closest comparison I can make is something the size of a large truck, or maybe even a bull. It had that general shape, low to the ground, 4 legs, a kind of heavy, solid presence. But the scale of it was completely wrong. For a split second, I just stared at it as I drove past. My headlights didn't fully illuminate it, so I couldn't see clear details like fur or eyes or anything like that. It was more like a silhouette, a dark, solid form standing in the yard. But even without details, I could tell how big it was, and that alone was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. Every instinct I had told me to get away from whatever that thing was. There was no curiosity in that moment, just a strong or immediate reaction to put distance between me and it. As the house disappeared behind me and the road stretched out ahead, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just a trick of the light or some object that looked different in the dark. But the image stuck in my mind. The size of it didn't make sense. The shape didn't make sense. After about a quarter of a mile, my thoughts started to shift. The fear faded just enough for curiosity to take its place. I started questioning what I had seen. Was it really that big, or did it just look that way in the dark? Could it have been something else entirely? I'm the kind of person who, in a horror movie, would probably make the worst decision possible just to figure something out, and that's exactly what I did. I slowed down, checked the road, and made a turn. Then I started driving back toward the house. As I got closer, I felt that same tension creeping back in. The road was still empty, the night still quiet, and now I was heading straight toward the place where I had seen something that didn't make sense. My headlights once again swept across the yard as I approached. I looked toward the exact spot where I had seen the shape. There was nothing there. The yard was completely empty. Just grass, still and unmoving, stretching out under the faint light. No dog, no figure, nothing even remotely close to the size or shape of what I had seen just minutes earlier. I slowed down even more, scanning the area carefully. I checked every corner of the yard that my headlights could reach. I looked closer to the house, farther out into the darkness, anywhere it could have possibly gone. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. I even considered the possibility that it had run off, but that didn't make sense either. Something that large would have made noise. I would have seen some kind of movement, some indication that it was leaving. But there had been nothing. It had just been there, and then it wasn't. After a few seconds, I felt that same unease building again, stronger this time. Being there, looking at that empty yard, felt worse than just driving past it the first time. It was like standing in a place where something had just happened, even though you couldn't prove it. I didn't stay long. I pressed the gas and drove away, this time not looking back. Even now I can still picture it clearly, that shape standing just outside the light, or too big to be anything normal, too real to just ignore. I've tried to come up with explanations over the years. Maybe it was some kind of large animal. Maybe the lighting distorted its size. Maybe my eyes played a trick on me in that exact moment. But none of those explanations feel completely right, because I know what I saw, and whatever it wasn't something I've ever seen before or since. When we first moved into my parents' house, there was one particularly strange thing we discovered that still gives me chills when I think about it. Above the back door, there were pipes that ran up to the bathroom upstairs. The previous owners had tried to hide them by building cupboards over the pipes. On the outside, they looked like normal cupboards, neat and functional, but inside, they were completely useless. The bottom of each cupboard was empty, except for the pipes running along it. There were no shelves, nothing to store anything, just a row of exposed pipes hidden behind cupboard doors. It was confusing and a little odd, but we didn't think much of it at first. A few months later, we had some plumbing work done. The plumbers opened up the cupboards to get to the pipes, and that's when they found something really strange. Hidden at the very bottom of the cupboards, just below the pipes, was a large kebab shop knife about 10 inches long. It was wrapped in newspaper, just left there as if no one had touched it for years. That was the only thing in the cupboards, completely out of place. I was 16 at the time and immediately asked my parents if they should take it to the police. They said no. I think they didn't want to dig into it. They just moved in and probably didn't want to risk uncovering something worse. My dad still keeps the knife somewhere in the house to this day. That wasn't the only strange thing that happened in that house. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen with my dad. He was across the room, his back to me, and suddenly he turned around with a shocked look on his face. "Did you just push past me?" he asked. I was standing 6 feet away, minding my own business. "No," I said. "Why?" "I just felt something push past me," he said, his voice tense. "Not a brush? A push." There was nobody else around. Another time, when I was 19 or 20, I was sitting in my room watching a massive storm outside. The rain was coming down so hard that you'd be soaked instantly if you stepped outside, and lightning flashed across the sky. I loved storms, so I was just enjoying the view. Suddenly, I heard what sounded like a couple of little girls laughing and talking from the corner of my room behind me. It was faint, but clear enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. My bedroom door was closed, and I got up to check. I looked outside in both directions along the street, but nobody was out there. And there were no kids in the neighboring houses who could have been playing in the storm. At the time, it was just my dad and me in the house. No TV, no radio, nobody else. I had no explanation for where the voices came from. Looking even further back in time, when I was between 8 and 10, my family was on holiday in a hotel. My sister, parents and I were all together when suddenly a voice whispered my dad's name loudly from behind us. We all heard it at the same time. Moments later, the radio switched on by itself. When I went to turn it off, the switch was already in the off position. I had to switch it on first and then back off to finally stop it. Over the years, more strange events occurred in the house. My dad, who has now lived there alone for nearly 10 years, recently experienced something that unsettled him. Well, one afternoon, he was standing in the hallway when he heard a voice behind him. It didn't form words, just a soft, garbled whisper. When he turned around, nobody was there. Another time, he was in the living room during the day, reading paperwork. Suddenly, a small, dim, white light appeared at chest level in front of him. It hovered, circled halfway around him, and then vanished without explanation. My mom has chronic fatigue syndrome, and at one point was taking short rests during the day. These rests weren't for sleeping, just lying down with her eyes closed. Even when she stayed fully awake, she sometimes heard footsteps moving around the bed. Middle of the day, in a quiet house, she could hear movement, yet no one else was there. My sister experienced her own share of strange happenings. Several times, as she was in my dad's office, the computer room where we kids would spend time, and the printer would suddenly turn on by itself. At the same time, the temperature in the room would drop noticeably. She also sometimes felt a presence in her own bedroom. She described feeling something sit on her bed, not directly on her, but enough to shift the mattress. On some nights, she even noticed an indentation in the mattress where whatever it was had settled. The house itself seemed alive in ways we couldn't understand. The cupboard with the hidden knife, the unexplained pushes and voices, the lights, the sudden changes in temperature, it all painted a picture of a home that held memories or presences we couldn't see. Even though I've had many experiences personally, my parents and sister have encountered even more, or often in ways that left them frightened or baffled. Thinking about it all now, I realized that these strange events weren't limited to isolated moments. They happened over years to all of us, in different ways, at different times of the day and night. Some things were subtle, like a push or a whisper. Others were impossible to ignore, like a knife hidden in a cupboard or voices that couldn't be explained. It made the house feel alive in a way that was beautiful, terrifying, and completely inexplicable all at once. Even today, when I look back on that house, I remember it not just as a place we lived, but as a house that seemed to exist alongside another reality. It was ordinary in the daytime, filled with family life, meals, and laughter. But behind the walls, in the quiet corners and the hidden spaces, something else existed. Something we could feel, hear, and sometimes even see, but never fully understand. A couple of years ago, I started realizing that a lot of the strangest experiences in my life weren't even my own at first. They came from stories told by people close to me. My dad, for example, spent 10 years working as a logger deep in the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. Most of what he personally went through was the kind of danger you'd expect from that kind of job. Long days, heavy machinery, isolation, and sometimes being a little too close to wild animals. One of his stories always stuck with me, though. He told me about a time he leaned against a tree to rest for a minute, just catching his breath, when a mountain lion quietly stepped into view. It wasn't aggressive, just there, watching. He said he didn't even panic. He just raised his hand a little and said, "Hey, cat." For a second, the animal froze, like it was deciding what to do, and then it disappeared back into the trees as silently as it had arrived. That was the kind of thing he called scary. But then there were the stories from the other loggers he worked with. Those were different. Those didn't feel grounded in reality the same way. One of his friends told him about driving late at night along a logging road, miles away from anything. It was just him and another guy in the truck, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. Out of nowhere, a bright light appeared around them. Not like headlights or a flashlight, this was something that surrounded the entire truck. The vehicle started shaking hard enough to scare both of them. They slowed down and pulled over as much as they could, not knowing what else to do. And then just as suddenly as it started, the light vanished. No sound, no fading, just gone. They never found an explanation for it, and neither of them ever experienced anything like it again. Another story came from a guy who was fishing deep in the forest near a river. It had been raining on and off all day, the kind of weather where everything is damp and quiet. There were small sandbanks along the river with patches of grass and young trees growing out of them. He and his friend waded out onto one of those sandbanks during a break in the rain. Then, just as the rain started again, he suddenly stopped walking. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring down. When his friend came over, he saw why. There was a footprint in the sand, huge, easily twice the size of their boots. It was fresh, too. It had to have been made in that short gap between the rain showers, because before that, the sand had been untouched. As they stood there looking at it, the rain slowly began to wash it away, like whatever had made it didn't want to leave any trace behind. For a while, my dad was engaged to a native woman, and she shared something that stayed with me just as much as those stories. She told me that when she was a little girl, her grandmother took her to a hillside and showed her a path where something massive had forced its way up through the trees. It wasn't just a trail. Young trees had been snapped, plants torn apart, like something incredibly strong had pushed straight through instead of going around. They had a name for it in their language, something that basically meant what most people would call Sasquatch. The way she told it wasn't like a ghost story meant to scare kids. It sounded more like something accepted as something known. Then there was my stepsister's uncle, a hunter who actually gave me my first guitar. One night while we were camping, he told a story that I still think about sometimes, especially because of how it was told. I was sitting with my back to the forest, which didn't help. He said he had been out hunting in the mountains and came across a natural clearing. He crouched down at the edge and started scanning the tree line with binoculars, looking for any movement. Then he noticed a smell, not just a bad smell, but something strong and overwhelming, enough to make him lower the binoculars and try to figure out where it was coming from. That's when he saw it. Something in the middle of the clearing stood up on two legs. At first, he thought it was a bear, but something about the way it moved wasn't right. It stood too straight, or too balanced. When he looked again, he saw the back of it as it walked away, upright, fast, and silent, disappearing into the trees. The smell lingered even after it was gone. My mom had her own set of experiences, and hers were just as strange in a completely different way. She grew up deep in the forest with her 4 younger sisters, far from towns or city lights. One night, they were all driving home together when the car suddenly started acting up. It sputtered and felt like it was about to die completely. Somehow, she managed to keep it going long enough to reach a gas station. They all got out to call their parents, trying to figure out what was wrong. And then, without anyone touching it, the car turned on by itself behind them. No one was inside. No one had the keys in the ignition. It just started. They still got back in and drove home, probably more confused than anything else. On the way, my mum glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something following them. She described it as football-shaped, glowing along the edges, moving at the same speed as their car, but staying up near the treetops. All four of her sisters saw it too. It followed them until they turned onto their road, and then it disappeared into the forest. Later, they heard that other people in the area had car trouble that same night. Another time, when my mom was a teenager, she and her roommates let a woman stay the night after being asked to help by a local church. Everything seemed normal at first, but in the middle of the night, they woke up to a low, strange sound coming from the bathroom. It sounded like someone mumbling or chanting. When they went to check, they found the woman standing there, speaking in a way that didn't sound natural. My mom said when she looked at the mirror, she saw something in it that didn't look human. That was enough for them. They didn't stay to figure it out. They climbed out the window and ran straight to a neighbor's house. For a long time, I thought all of these were just stories. Strange, maybe exaggerated, but still just stories. Then I started having my own experiences. When I was a teenager, I was sitting in a hot tub in eastern Washington with my cousin, just relaxing and looking up at the night sky. Everything was calm, quiet, nothing unusual. Then suddenly a bright green arc spread across the sky. It wasn't like anything I had seen before. There was a glowing mass on one side of it, and for a moment we both just stared, trying to understand what we were looking at. Then it blinked, like someone had turned it off and on again, and started moving in a sharp, zigzag pattern. That was the moment it stopped being interesting and started being terrifying. I got out of the hot tub immediately and ran inside, trying to explain what we had just seen. My cousin followed, backing me up, but my aunt didn't really believe us. Years later, I was at my aunt's house in Wenatchee. The property was surrounded by a cemetery, an apple orchard, and open hills. One winter night, everything was covered in snow, and the moonlight made it bright enough to see clearly. My cousins and I decided to go outside and play hide and seek in the orchard. Of course, I ended up being the one who had to find everyone. After counting, I started walking through the rows of trees, listening for any sound, trying to spot movement. I eventually reached the far edge of the orchard, near an old building. As I turned around to head back, I heard a voice, clear as day. It said, "Over here." At first, I thought one of my cousins was trying to mess with me, so I laughed and called out a name. There was no response, just silence. Then the voice came again, a little closer this time. "Over here, come closer." There was still no one there, just the building, the trees, and the snow. I took a few steps forward, still trying to convince myself it was one of them playing a trick. But then something changed. I can't really explain it properly, but I felt this sudden, overwhelming fear. Not the kind that builds up slowly, but the kind that hits you all at once, like your body knows something is wrong before your mind does. I didn't wait to figure it out. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back into the orchard, yelling for everyone. When they saw me, they could tell something wasn't right, and we all went back inside. The next day, I went back to that spot in daylight trying to make sense of it. I thought maybe there had been a house nearby, or something that could have explained the voice. There wasn't anything, just that same empty building and open space. The last thing that ever happened to me was years later. My husband and I were visiting some friends in the city. One of them offered us a book about spirituality and kept insisting that we take it, saying it would change our perspective. I didn't like the feeling I got from it, so we politely said no and left it there. About 3 months later, we opened the trunk of our SUV to get the spare tire, and there it was, the same book. Neither of us had taken it. We hadn't seen it since that day. There was no reason for it to be in our car. We didn't question it too much. We just threw it away immediately. I remember thinking that if it ever came back, I'd burn it without hesitation. But it never did. Most of these things happened a long time ago, and I'm sure some details have faded over time. But when I think about all of them together, the stories from my dad, my mom, and my own experiences, it leaves me with a strange feeling. Not exactly belief, but not disbelief either. Just the sense that there are things out there that don't fit neatly into explanation, and maybe they never will. If you've made it this far, you're braver than most people, and the stories only get more disturbing from here. So, if you haven't already, subscribe and let me know in the comments which story has stuck with you the most so far. I've never been the kind of person who believes in ghosts or spirits or anything like that. Even now, I still think most of the strange things people claim to see are just tricks of the mind, stress, or imagination filling in gaps. I've always tried to look for logical explanations first. But there was one moment in my life that didn't fit into anything I understood, and no matter how many times I've gone over it in my head, I still can't explain it. A few years ago, something terrible happened at the company where I work. One of our employees, a guy who had been with us for about 9 years, was murdered by his wife. It shook everyone. He wasn't just some random worker people barely knew. He'd been around for a long time, part of daily routines, someone people greeted every morning and worked alongside for years. Losing him like that, in such a violent way, left a strange feeling behind in the place where he used to work. After his death, some of the guys at the warehouse started saying they didn't like going to that part of the building alone. At first, I didn't take it seriously at all. They would say they heard footsteps when no one was there, or random noises that didn't make sense. Some even claimed they felt like someone was watching them. To me, it all sounded like the kind of stories people tell each other after something tragic happens. When emotions are high, your mind starts playing tricks on you. That's what I believed, and honestly, that's still what I think happens most of the time. I used to laugh it off whenever they brought it up. I'd tell them they were just scaring themselves, or that the human brain is great at creating patterns and filling in silence with imagined sounds. I had read enough and seen enough to know how easily perception can be distorted, so I never paid attention to any of it. To me, there was always a logical explanation, even if we didn't immediately see it. Back when that employee was still working with us, the company uniform was jeans with a denim shirt. It was something everyone wore, so it became a familiar look tied to that time. Years passed, and eventually the uniform changed, like things always do. Life moved on, routines shifted, and while people still remembered him, the intensity of that initial shock faded. About 6 years after his death, something happened that brought everything back in a way I wasn't prepared for. It was a Monday morning, and we found out that the batteries from one of our trucks had been stolen. The truck had been parked in the lot over the weekend, so the theft must have happened sometime between Saturday night and early Monday morning. Naturally, I went to check the CCTV footage to see if we could catch whoever did it. I sat down in front of the monitor and started reviewing the recordings at double speed. It's a boring process, just watching hours of empty parking lot footage, waiting for something to happen. Nothing unusual showed up at first. Just the usual stillness, occasional movement of shadows, maybe some light changes as time passed. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed something. It was just a glimpse at first. Around 11:26 a.m. on Sunday, I saw what looked like a person standing in the middle of the parking lot. It was so brief that I almost thought I imagined it. But something about it made me stop the video immediately. I maximized the camera view and rewound the footage. At that moment, one of my co-workers was standing nearby, also looking at the screen. Before I could even say anything, she spoke. "You saw that? Rewind it." That alone made my stomach drop a little. It meant I hadn't imagined it. Someone else saw it too. I moved the footage back to around 11:22 and started playing it again, this time at normal speed. We both watched closely, waiting for that moment. At 11:24, the image suddenly glitched. It wasn't a normal kind of glitch like a small flicker or distortion. It was more like those scenes you see in movies where a video feed gets tampered with. The image kind of jumped for a split second. And then, suddenly, there was a man standing right in the middle of the frame. He wasn't walking into the scene. He wasn't coming from the side. He was just there, standing still. The first thing I noticed was the way he stood, straight, almost stiff, like someone standing at attention. The second thing that hit me was what he was wearing. Jeans and a denim shirt, the old uniform. My immediate reaction wasn't fear. It was excitement mixed with relief. I thought we had caught the person who stole the batteries. Finally, something useful. But then things started to feel off. The image wasn't perfectly clear, but it was clear enough to make out details, the posture, the clothing, even the general shape and build of the person. There was something about it that felt familiar, but I couldn't quite place it in that moment. And my mind was still focused on the idea that this was our suspect. We kept watching. At 11:27, the image glitched again, and just like that, the man was gone. No movement, no walking away, no fading, just there 1 second, and not there the next. I looked at my co-worker, and she looked back at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. We were both trying to process what we had just seen. I immediately rewound the footage again. This time, I set it to start at 11:23. We watched carefully, expecting to see the same thing again. But nothing happened. The footage played normally. No glitch, no man. Just an empty parking lot. We let it run past 11:27, then 11:28. Still nothing. I rewound it again. Same result. We tried multiple times, adjusting the timing slightly, watching closely for any sign of what we had just seen. But it never appeared again. The footage remained completely normal, as if that moment had never existed. That's when the realization started to sink in. We had both seen it, at the same time, clear enough to react to it, to stop the video, to rewind and confirm it. And then it was just gone. No explanation, no trace. Even now, when I think about it, I get that same uneasy feeling. I can still picture it clearly in my mind, the way the figure stood, the clothes, the stillness, and the fact that it wasn't just me. If I had been alone, I would have eventually convinced myself that I imagined it, that my brain filled in something that wasn't really there. But my co-worker saw it too, and she reacted before I even said anything. That's the part that makes it hard to dismiss. I've tried to come up with logical explanations, Maybe it was a camera glitch combined with some kind of visual artifact. Maybe the system briefly pulled an old frame from years ago, though that doesn't really make sense. Maybe it was some kind of playback error. But none of those explanations fully fit what we experienced. We never saw that figure again in any of the footage. Not before, not after. It was just that one moment, and then nothing. I still don't believe in ghosts in the way most people describe them. I still think there's probably a logical explanation out there somewhere. But this is one of those things that sits in the back of my mind, unanswered. And honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to explain it. I've had my fair share of strange experiences, and most of them happened in South Texas. There's just something about that area. Its wide open landscapes, the quiet back roads, and lingering old stories that seems to invite the unusual. One experience in particular has stayed with me more vividly than the rest, and I think about it every time I pass through that part of the state. It all started one evening when my cousin and I were driving back from her dad's lake house. We had stayed later than we had intended, probably around 10 or 10:30 at night. The sky had already darkened, and the lake house felt deserted and quiet. We still had about an hour's drive to get back to my place on the coast, and since I knew a shortcut through San Patricio, we decided to take it to save some time. I had grown up around that area, from the beaches to the hills, so as we drove, we started talking about local legends and creepy stories. My cousin began telling me about some of the more notorious ones, the story of Goatman's Playground, for example, and a strange tale about a Nazi who supposedly lived in an abandoned airport. I laughed along with her, partly because it was funny to hear these urban legends, but partly because I knew most of them were exaggerated over the years. Then I mentioned something that had always stuck with me from childhood. "Well," I said, "we're on Highway 666. Have you ever heard of Chipita?" Her eyes widened a little. I started explaining. The story went that a woman from Mexico had moved to San Patricio with her husband and children. Her husband would leave for months at a time, traveling back to Mexico for work. While he was away, she supposedly fell in love with another man. But he made it clear that he wouldn't marry her if she already had children. Faced with that impossible demand, the story says she did something horrifying. She killed her children. The man she loved wanted nothing to do with her afterward, and when her husband returned, he reported her. She was said to be the first woman ever hanged in Texas. The tale always sent shivers down my spine as a kid, and even now, I could never tell it without feeling a little uneasy. As we drove closer to the old courthouse in San Patricio, which still stands today, my cousin reacted strongly. "How could a woman do that?" she said. "That's insane. She got what she deserved." Her voice was a mixture of shock and disgust. At that very moment, something strange happened. Her windshield fogged up. It was warm outside, probably around 80 degrees, and the windows were down, letting the night air swirl through the car. We both stared at the windshield, completely confused. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog cleared. Almost immediately, she had to swerve to avoid an armadillo that darted across the road. The timing was uncanny, and I felt a chill run down my spine. We drove past the courthouse, and even the grounds where they hold rattlesnake races during certain times of the year. My cousin started talking again, this time trying to lighten the mood, but then, bam, the windshield fogged up again. This time it didn't clear. I looked at her and said, "Apologize." She gave me a look, clearly thinking I had lost my mind, but after a brief hesitation, she muttered a quick, "Sorry." Almost instantly, the fog disappeared. We didn't say another word after that. and the rest of the drive to the next town passed in tense silence. I didn't think much about the incident again until about a year later, when I found myself on that same stretch of road once more. It was Halloween, and my friends and I were bored. We were too young for bars, and the parties in town were dull at best. I suggested we check out a cemetery off Highway 666 just to have something to do that evening. There were about 10 of us in total. We wandered around the cemetery, joking and teasing each other about ghosts and spirits, but nothing seemed particularly creepy at first. My best friend had brought her camera, and the two of us decided to explore deeper, looking for old and interesting headstones. The others stayed behind, wandering in other sections. We stopped at one grave that caught my attention. It had a delicate iron fence around it, almost like a little cage protecting the headstone. As I glanced around, something white caught the corner of my eye. I nudged my friend and pointed it out. She noticed it too. At first, I thought it might be a rabbit or a stray cat. We moved closer, curious but cautious. The animal, or whatever it was, appeared black and white, with large patches of color across its body, almost like a tuxedo pattern. My friend began softly talking to it, reaching out a hand. It lifted its head, and I immediately felt something was off. Then it did something I will never forget. It stood up, on two legs. We froze, unable to move, staring at it. It didn't behave like an animal at all. It looked straight at us and then began walking backward, still facing us, keeping eye contact the entire time. My friend snapped out of her shock and raised her camera to take a picture, but before she could even click, it turned and ran off, still upright, still moving like a person. Within seconds, it was gone. We just stood there, staring at each other, both silently asking the same question. What the hell was that? The rest of the night was spent with nervous laughter, trying to convince ourselves we had imagined it, but neither of us could shake the memory. The next day, I shared the story with a coworker. There was an older Hispanic woman at work, someone who mostly kept to herself and spent mornings making tortillas. When she overheard me, she became suddenly interested. She asked me to tell her everything in detail. When I finished, she nodded knowingly and said it was a duende, a type of spirit in Mexican folklore, similar to a leprechaun. According to her, they are small, about 1.5 feet tall, and they do not like being seen. They aren't inherently good or evil, but you do not want to upset them. I asked her what happens if someone does upset a duende. She gave me a serious look and said simply, "Mijita, don't go back there." I haven't gone back. Even now, I can't explain everything that happened that night on Highway 666 or at the cemetery. I can only tell what I saw and what I felt. From the fogging windshield to the upright animal-like figure, the events were bizarre in a way that makes you question what's real. South Texas is full of wide open spaces and quiet back roads, but it's also full of stories, legends, and things that don't always make sense. Those nights taught me that some places hold more than just history. They hold echoes of the past, and sometimes those echoes are still very much alive. I've shared this story with a few friends over the years, and most of them either laugh it off or give me that skeptical look. But for me, the memory is as clear as the fog that appeared on that windshield. Some things in life just don't have an explanation, and that's part of what makes them terrifying. You drive through these back roads, and for a moment, everything feels normal. The wind, the road, the trees. But then, without warning, you encounter something that makes you realize the world is bigger, stranger, and far more mysterious than you ever imagined. Even when I think back to the cemetery, I can still feel the weight of that moment. That small, upright figure, whatever it was, wasn't trying to scare us. Yet, it made its presence known in the most undeniable way. I've always been curious about the old stories, the legends passed down through generations. But after that night, curiosity was mixed with caution. There's a respect that comes with acknowledging things you don't understand, a quiet awareness that some places are better left alone. Since then, I've told this story more than once, always careful to describe it exactly as it happened. Every detail matters. The timing of the fog, the way my cousin's windshield reacted, the way the figure moved, and the warnings of those who understood the old stories. These experiences stay with you. They don't fade over time. And even though I haven't returned to those roads or that cemetery, I feel their presence every time I drive through South Texas. It's a strange, haunting reminder that some stories are real, and some places are alive in ways you can't begin to explain. Several years ago, I moved into a beautiful old house in North Carolina that had originally been a stable. It had been renovated into a 3-story home, but even after the changes, you could still feel its age in the wooden beams, the creaking floors, and the way the walls seemed to hold onto every sound. The landlord lived on the 2nd floor, which was also the main part of the house, while I moved into the 1st floor. On the 3rd floor, there was a quiet man from Scotland who mostly kept to himself. The place came fully furnished, and the rent was only $400 a month, which felt like a steal. At 22, I didn't think too deeply about anything beyond how lucky I was to find such a good deal. When I first moved in, they casually mentioned that the house was haunted. It wasn't a serious conversation, more like a passing comment, almost as if they were joking or just stating something that didn't really matter. I remember shrugging it off immediately. At that age, I thought I understood the world well enough to know that ghosts weren't real. I didn't even give it a second thought after that. The first few months were completely normal. Nothing strange happened, and the house felt like any other place. I settled into a routine, got comfortable with the layout, and even started to enjoy the unique atmosphere of living in such an old building. The wooden floors creaked here and there, but that was expected in a house with so much history. Sometimes the pipes made noise, and occasionally there were drafts that made doors shift slightly, but I always found logical explanations for everything. Then, one night changed how I looked at that house completely. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was upstairs on the 2nd floor with the landlord's son, Josh. We were sitting in his room, watching a horror movie on Netflix, with all the lights turned off. The only light in the room came from the TV screen, casting a soft glow across the walls and furniture. The rest of the house was completely quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier late at night. I was relaxed, focused on the movie, when something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. It was subtle at first, just a slight movement, but enough to pull my focus away from the screen. I turned my head slightly and noticed that the bathroom door, which had been standing open, was slowly moving. At first, I thought it might just be my imagination. Or maybe it was the movie putting me on edge, or maybe it was just the way the shadows were shifting in the dim light. But as I kept watching, I realized the door was actually moving. It wasn't swinging freely or being pushed by a sudden gust of air. It was slowly, steadily creaking closed, as if someone was gently pushing it. I nudged Josh and told him to look, but by the time he turned his head, the door had stopped moving. He didn't see anything unusual and just brushed it off. I felt a little uneasy, but I didn't want to overreact. I told myself it was probably just a draft or something simple. We went back to watching the movie, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had settled in the room. A few minutes passed, and I started to relax again. Then, without warning, I noticed the door moving again. This time, it was more obvious. It was slowly closing, inch by inch, making a faint creaking sound as it moved. I pointed it out again, and this time Josh saw it. He sat up, stared at the door for a moment, and then got out of bed to check the bathroom. I watched him walk over, push the door open, and look inside. The light flicked on briefly, and everything seemed normal. There was no one there, nothing out of place. He came back and sat down like it was no big deal. I was expecting him to say something logical, maybe explain it as a draft or a loose hinge. Instead, he looked at me calmly and said not to worry. According to him, it was just the ghost. The way he said it made it even more unsettling. There was no fear in his voice, no hesitation, just a casual acceptance, like he had seen this kind of thing many times before. He also told me not to talk about it too much because, in his words, that only made things worse. I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to treat it like a joke, but another part of me couldn't ignore what I had just seen. The door had moved on its own twice, and there was no clear explanation for it. We tried to continue watching the movie, but it was hard to focus now. Every small sound in the room felt amplified. The creak of the bed, the faint hum of the TV, even our own breathing seemed louder than before. I kept glancing toward the bathroom door, half expecting it to start moving again. As the movie reached its final scenes, I started to feel slightly calmer. Nothing else had happened, and I began convincing myself that maybe it really was just a strange coincidence. Maybe the house settled in a weird way, or maybe there was some airflow we didn't notice. Then something happened that completely shattered any sense of logic I was holding on to. At the foot of the bed, there was a small side table with a coffee mug on it. Josh had been drinking tea from it earlier, and it had been sitting there untouched for quite a while. There was no movement around it, nothing that could have disturbed it. Out of nowhere, the mug tipped over. It didn't slide or wobble first. It just suddenly fell, as if someone had pushed it. It hit the floor with a sharp sound that echoed in the quiet room. Before either of us could react, the bathroom door slammed shut. Not slowly, not gently like before, but violently, with a loud bang that made both of us jump. The room fell completely silent after that. Neither of us said anything for a moment. The air felt heavy, like something had changed, like we weren't alone anymore. I don't remember much of what happened immediately after that. I think we just sat there, trying to process what we had seen. There was no logical explanation left. The door had moved on its own. The mug had fallen without any cause, and the final slam felt deliberate, almost like a response. That night, I went back to my room on the first floor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every shadow looked darker, every sound made me tense up. I kept thinking about what Josh had said, about how it was just the ghost, and how talking about it made things worse. For the first time since moving into that house, I started to believe that maybe what they told me on the first day wasn't a joke. Maybe there really was something there. I didn't turn the lights off when I went to bed. I couldn't. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and movement in the house, wondering if something was watching me the same way I had watched that door slowly close. That was the first night I truly felt afraid in that house, and it changed how I saw everything after that. The place that once felt like a lucky find now felt like something else entirely, something I didn't fully understand. And no matter how much I tried to explain it away, I couldn't forget what I had seen. When I was younger, I had one of those moments that sticks with you, the kind that feels too strange to fully explain. I was walking up the stairs at home, the steps familiar beneath my feet, the house quiet as usual. I was just halfway up when something made me stop dead in my tracks. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but then I saw it, a sort of mist, faint and shimmering, like smoke caught in a beam of sunlight. It moved down the stairs, not like a person or an animal, more like it was flowing, almost liquid, and then, impossibly, it passed straight through me. I froze on the spot, unsure if I was dreaming or imagining it. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't move. For a few moments, or maybe longer, time seemed to stretch. I just stayed there, halfway up the staircase, staring at the empty space where the mist had gone. My younger brother was at the bottom of the stairs, and after a moment, I finally found my voice and asked him if he had seen anything. He shook his head, saying he hadn't noticed a thing. That only made it feel stranger. I had been frozen, completely still, while he carried on like nothing had happened. The sense of being stopped in my own body, of something moving through me that wasn't supposed to exist, left me uneasy for the rest of the day. Years later, another incident happened that, while different, felt connected in its strangeness. About once a week, I go to my parents' house for tea. My brother often comes along with his young son, who is about 18 months old. Most of the time, our visits are ordinary, laughing over snacks, helping the little one with his food, chatting about nothing in particular. But every now and then, something odd happens. My nephew will suddenly stop what he's doing, stare intently at a specific spot near the kitchen door, and refuse to move or look anywhere else. Then, after a few seconds, he'll turn back to us as if nothing happened and carry on playing or eating. It's brief, but there's a weight to it, a feeling like he's seen something that we adults cannot. My mum once told me that when they were looking after my older brother's rabbits, the same sort of thing happened. The rabbits would spend most of their time in the kitchen, and they would all suddenly fix their gaze on that same spot by the door, just staring. There was no obvious reason. The floor was empty, the walls bare, but they were captivated. At the time it seemed strange, but we could laugh it off as the quirks of animals, or maybe an accident of light or shadow. But the fact that my nephew did the exact same thing made it impossible to dismiss completely. Last week we were all gathered for tea, the usual warmth of chatter and smells of snacks filling the kitchen. My nephew was sitting in his high chair, swinging his tiny legs and babbling, mostly making noises, since he's only just starting to speak in words. Then, just like before, he froze, staring at that same spot near the kitchen door. At first, we did what we normally do, asking, "What is he looking at?" laughing nervously as we tried to make sense of his fascination. But this time, it escalated. He started pointing at the spot, making noises and gestures like he was trying to communicate. It looked like a conversation in miniature, a full exchange that only he could see or understand. He would point, then laugh, then babble back at it, or fully engaged as if the thing he was interacting with was alive, present, and responding. I nearly jumped out of my chair. There was a deep, unshakable feeling in that moment, a recognition that something was there that shouldn't be, something that existed just beyond our perception. It wasn't frightening in a violent sense, but it was completely unsettling. the kind of thing that raises the hairs on the back of your neck and makes your mind spin with questions. For a moment, the kitchen felt different, heavy with a presence we couldn't identify. The laughter and babbling of my nephew, normally innocent and light-hearted, took on a strange weight, as though he was interacting with an unseen companion. What's so remarkable about it is how clear it all felt. Children often notice things adults can't. But this wasn't imagination or a trick of the light. The timing, the consistency, the way both animals and a toddler focused on the same spot across years, these things stacked together to make the experience undeniable. You can try to rationalize it, tell yourself it's just a child's attention wandering, or rabbits reacting to a shadow or reflection, but the coincidence is too precise to ignore. Thinking back on both moments, the mist on the stairs and my nephew's interaction in the kitchen, they share something intangible. In both, there is an awareness of something unseen, something that seems aware of us in return, that exerts a subtle influence on the environment. The mist physically passed through me, altering my sense of space, while my nephew's interaction reminded me that perception isn't just limited to what we adults can see. Children and even animals may pick up on subtle presences or energies that our rational minds have long dismissed. Even now, I can remember that spot near the kitchen door clearly. It's ordinary enough by daylight, a corner framed by the wall and the edge of the doorway, with nothing remarkable about it to the eye. And yet, whenever I return there, there's a subtle pause in the air, a faint sensation that something lingers just beyond normal perception. I've begun to watch my nephew more closely when he stares, trying to understand what he sees, trying to feel what he feels. Sometimes I swear I can sense a shift in the air, a quiet pressure, a momentary coldness, or a weight pressing on my awareness. It's fleeting, subtle, but unmistakable. I've tried to capture the feeling of the stare incident in words, but it's almost impossible. The way the mist moved, the way it passed through me, the way my body froze as if restrained by invisible hands. It all feels impossible to describe with ordinary language. It wasn't fear like a nightmare. It wasn't a hallucination or a dream. It was real, grounded, and vivid. The uncertainty of what it was, coupled with the fact that no one else saw it, made it haunting in a very specific way. Now, looking back on these experiences, I realize that there's a continuity in the strange things I've witnessed. Children, animals, and even adults can experience the subtle presence of something beyond ordinary perception. These moments aren't always frightening. Sometimes they are just there, lingering, observing, a reminder that the world we perceive is only part of what exists. And while I have no answers, I've learned to respect that presence, to notice it quietly, and to leave room for the inexplicable in my understanding of the world. These experiences have left an imprint on me, subtle but persistent. They shape the way I notice movement in empty rooms, the way I sense weight and stillness in familiar spaces, and the way I pay attention to children and animals when they fixate on something invisible. It's not something I can fully explain, but it's something I carry with me, quietly and vividly, a reminder that sometimes the unseen is more real than we allow ourselves to believe. Even on ordinary days, when I pass that staircase or glance at that corner in my parents' kitchen, I feel it, a faint sense of presence, like a whisper on the edge of awareness, a memory of a mist that passed through me and the gaze of a toddler interacting with the invisible. It is a reminder that the world is bigger than what we can see, and that sometimes the extraordinary touches us in ways too subtle for words, leaving us both unsettled and awed at the same time. My boyfriend and I share a car, and at that time we both had pretty long commutes to work, about 30 to 45 minutes each way. We live in a very rural area, so most of our drive is just a straight road through open farmland before we eventually reach the highway. It's the kind of place where there aren't many houses around, and at night it can feel incredibly quiet and empty, almost like you're the only ones in the world. One night, both of us had worked late. I just closed at my job, and he had closed at his. I finished my shift first and decided to wait in his parking lot until he could get out. His workplace was short-staffed that night, so he didn't finish until around 2:30 in the morning. Normally I would have been annoyed about the wait, but honestly, after a long day, neither of us had much energy to complain. And we were both just ready to get home, tired but content to be driving back together. We finally left and got on the highway, the kind that stretches straight for miles with nothing but fields on either side. We chatted about our days, joking and laughing, swapping stories about co-workers and little things that had happened during our shifts. Music was playing softly, and the road was quiet except for the occasional passing car. It was one of those nights where everything felt normal, almost peaceful, the kind of drive that usually lets you unwind after work. About 10 miles down the road after taking our exit, something happened that neither of us could have expected. I was driving and, without really thinking, glanced over at him as we talked. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something white suddenly jump up on the side of the car. It wasn't small either. It seemed to reach about half the height of the car before it completely exploded into pieces and smashed directly into the side view mirror. We both froze for a moment. Neither of us could even process what had just happened. The first thought that went through my head was, did we just hit a deer? A bird? Something else? We checked the car as best we could while still moving. Everything seemed fine. The tires were holding air, the car was driving normally, and there was no sign that anything serious had happened. But the idea of stopping on a dark, empty country road in the middle of the night, especially at 3 in the morning, was completely out of the question. There was no way we were pulling over in that area. It just didn't feel safe. We decided to keep going and get home first. Once we finally arrived, we got out and looked more closely at the side view mirror. That's when we saw it. Something was hanging from the mirror, stuck there. At first, we thought maybe we had hit a bird, one of those that might have been taking off suddenly. But as we examined it more closely, it became obvious that it wasn't a bird at all. What had somehow jumped out of nowhere and hit the car was a full stalk of corn. A single stalk, broken and bent from the impact, somehow launched itself through the air with enough force to smash into the mirror. What made it even more unbelievable was that the nearest cornfield was at least 6 to 10 feet away from the road, and there was a ditch separating the field from where we were driving. There was absolutely no logical way it could have ended up hitting the side of our car the way it did. We stood there for a moment, staring at the stalk, trying to make sense of what had happened. Neither of us could explain it. There were no tractors nearby, no windstorm, nothing that could have propelled it. It just jumped, exploded in midair, and hit the mirror. It was so surreal that even now I can't explain it properly. The whole situation was terrifying in the moment, because for a second we genuinely thought we'd hit something dangerous or that the car might be damaged, and the idea of being stranded on a dark country road at that hour made the adrenaline spike. Eventually we laughed nervously, still a little shaken. It was such a random, absurd thing, that we had no choice but to treat it as a bizarre story to tell later. Even as I recount it now, I can still picture the way it happened. The stork seemingly flying out of nowhere and smashing against the mirror like it had a mind of its own. Driving through rural areas can feel peaceful, but it can also be strangely eerie, and that night reminded us of just how unpredictable it can be. Even now, whenever we drive past that area or see a cornfield from a distance, we can't help but remember that moment. It's a story we tell each other every now and then, laughing at the absurdity, but still with that tiny bit of unease lingering in the back of our minds. Who knows how it happened? Was it the wind? Some odd optical illusion? A fluke of physics? We'll probably never know. What we do know is that it was terrifying, completely unexpected, and has stayed with us ever since. That simple drive home turned into one of the strangest experiences of our lives. A reminder that sometimes the world throws the most random, inexplicable things your way when you least expect them. I've lived with reactive attachment disorder for as long as I can remember, and it has made certain parts of life extremely difficult for me. Depression, anxiety, and the emotional weight of feeling disconnected from people I should trust are constant companions. I've been through many dark periods, some more intense than others, and I've learned to cope in ways that don't involve medication. I've had times when the sadness and despair are almost overwhelming, nights where I cry until I fall asleep, and mornings when waking up feels like an achievement in itself. But even in all of that, I never expected what happened to me one particular night to feel so real, so immediate, and so terrifying that it lingered with me for months afterward. It was late October, the night of the 13th, moving into the early hours of the 14th. I'd spent the evening feeling the weight of my depression pressing down on me in ways I hadn't felt in a long time. I'd cried myself to sleep again, as I had many nights before. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to quiet down, cycling through all the things I couldn't change, the fears and regrets that never seemed to leave. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. My eyes opened to the familiar darkness of my apartment, but something felt off right away. I glanced at the clock on my phone. It was 3:34 a.m. Betty, my cat, was walking around on the bed, pawing and nudging at me as she often does in the early morning hours. I felt a dull irritation at the interruption, mostly because I wasn't ready to deal with anything else at that moment. Then I heard the sound of my alarm going off. My sleep cycle app was ringing, though I had it set for 5:30 to 6 a.m. I frowned, frustrated that the technology I relied on was failing me, and for a moment I thought maybe I had accidentally changed the settings. I sighed and rolled over, trying to go back to sleep. Then I heard it, the faint chime of my computer powering on from the living room. At first, I assumed it was Varda, my other cat, walking over the desk and pressing something accidentally. That seemed logical, and I almost ignored it, thinking maybe one of the cats had walked over the mouse. But then, a few seconds later, I saw the glow of the monitor light turn on. I froze. This wasn't normal. My cats could never do that. There was no way either of them could have powered on the computer and turned the monitor on. My initial reaction was irritation mixed with confusion. "Ah, damn cats," I muttered under my breath. Betty stomping around and Varda messing with stuff. I kept grumbling quietly, pacing slightly in my bed as I tried to make sense of it. For a moment I thought maybe I was still half asleep and hallucinating. My depression often made nights feel surreal. But this felt too vivid, too real. The sound of the computer running, the glowing monitor, the cats calmly ignoring everything. It didn't make sense. I turned on my bedside lamp to see more clearly, expecting to find the cats running around or something simple explaining the noise. Both of them were laying at the end of the bed, staring straight toward the living room, as if they were watching something I couldn't see. My confusion deepened. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the lamp flicker was tricking my eyes. Perhaps the sounds were echoes or my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of my front door opening. At first, it was just a screen door, sliding open quietly but clearly. Then I heard the handle turn and a soft click as the door moved across its frame. After that, footsteps, soft, deliberate and slow, moving across the carpet. My heart stopped. I froze completely. I had never felt fear like this in my apartment before. I was sure that someone had broken in. I moved cautiously, like you see in movies, trying to make as little noise as possible. My mind raced with the questions. Had I locked the door? Was this someone breaking in to hurt me? Why hadn't I heard anything earlier? I crept down the hall, tense and alert, barely daring to breathe. My cats, curiously, or did not react at all. They stayed on the bed, lying there as though the intruder didn't exist. Their calmness only added to the strangeness of the situation. Peeking around the corner, I froze again. Everything appeared normal. The door was closed. The lights in the living room were off. The monitor was dark. Yet I could still hear the computer running, quietly humming somewhere beyond my line of sight. I couldn't understand it. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I was hearing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed awake, moving only when necessary, checking every sound, every shadow, every little creak of the apartment. My usual confidence in my own home, the sense of safety and control I had built over years, was gone. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and completely unsure of what had happened. Was it a dream? Some kind of hallucination? Maybe sleepwalking? I didn't know. I only knew that it felt real, terrifyingly real, and it shook me in a way nothing else had. Even now, when I think about that night, the feelings come back as if I'm standing there again. The weight of fear, the sudden awareness of being watched, the dissonance between what my eyes were seeing and what my ears were hearing, all of it is burned into my memory. I have no explanation. It hasn't happened again, but for weeks afterward, I felt uneasy, even in familiar spaces. I felt like there was a presence lingering just beyond my perception, like I wasn't entirely alone in the world I thought I understood. I've tried to rationalize it countless times. Maybe it was a technical glitch, the computer powering itself on, in some strange coincidence. Maybe it was my depression amplifying normal nighttime noises into something threatening. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Yet even with every possible explanation, nothing fits perfectly. The clarity of the sounds, the monitor turning on, the sense of someone moving through the apartment, all of it felt too concrete to be imagined. That night reminded me of something I rarely allow myself to admit. No matter how much we think we understand our world, there are moments that can strip away that certainty in an instant. There are things we experience that don't fit into reason, things that leave us shaken and aware of just how fragile our sense of safety can be. I've lived alone for years and never felt this way before. It was a night that changed my perception of what was possible, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. Or even now, years later, I can remember the details with perfect clarity, the time on the clock, the exact way the cats were positioned, the faint chime of the computer, and the strange, cold feeling of hearing something moving in my apartment when nothing should have been. It was a moment of fear, unlike anything I had felt before, and it has stayed with me, a reminder that some things in life don't have explanations, and some experiences leave marks on the mind long after they pass. It was around 1 in the morning when we got dispatched to a house for a prowler call. The streets were quiet, the kind of late-night silence that made every little sound feel amplified. We rolled up to the residence and met with the people who had called. Right away, it was clear they weren't intoxicated, high, or otherwise out of touch with reality. Their story was calm and matter-of-fact, which was always a relief, because sometimes you show up to a prowler call and realize the resident is seeing things, whether from drugs, alcohol, or mental health issues, but not this time. The residents explained that they had seen 2 people in the yard across the street wearing masks. One was a Jason-style hockey mask, the kind you see in horror movies, and the other I couldn't recall later. Given that it was only a couple of weeks past Halloween, it seemed plausible that someone might still be out playing pranks or dressing up, though it was a little odd for the middle of the night. We took the details seriously and checked the area thoroughly, but we didn't see anything. We reported back to dispatch 10/8 and left it at that for the moment. An hour later, things escalated. We were called back to the same location. This time, we had dispatch on the line with the residents as we were surrounding the area. There were about 5 of us, positioning ourselves strategically, and dispatch could still see the supposed prowlers in the next yard, which immediately put everyone on edge. It's one thing to check a yard on your own after a call. It's another to be told in real time that someone is supposedly watching you from across the street while your team is in place. We started moving in cautiously. Dispatch relayed that the residents could see the 2 figures wave and then move into a shed. I happened to be positioned right next to that shed. My heart was racing a little, not because I'm prone to fear, but because the situation was so unusual and unsettling. I called out verbally, giving commands for them to come out, and even banged on the door of the shed. Nothing. Silence. My training kicked in. I was ready for anything, but nothing in my experience could fully explain what I was seeing. After a few moments, I decided to check inside. The shed door opened easily, and the first thing I noticed was nothing. Completely empty. My mind raced. I even thought to check for a trap door or some hidden exit, but the shed was raised about 4 inches off the ground, and there was no way anyone could have quietly slipped out without being seen or leaving marks. I checked every corner, every possible hiding spot, and there was no one there. Nothing. Confused and more than a little unsettled, I returned to the residents to talk it through. They confirmed what they had seen. As I moved toward the shed, the 2 figures had put their fingers to their lips, signaling shh, and then waved at them before disappearing into the shed as I stood right next to it. It was impossible. No trap doors, no hidden exits, no way for 2 adults to vanish that quickly or silently. We retraced our steps, checked the surrounding yards, and even looked for nearby alleyways or hidden paths. Every possible logical explanation was exhausted. There was nothing, no sign of them anywhere. It didn't add up. If the residents had been joking or trying to prank us, it would have been one thing. But this family had no history of making false calls. They were credible, calm, and clearly not inclined to lie or exaggerate. This wasn't some recurring call for service where the resident had been known to play games with dispatch. I don't consider myself a believer in paranormal activity, and I usually try to rationalize these situations as much as possible. But that night, even my logical mind couldn't come up with an explanation. Everything we know about the physical world, about how people move and hide, suggested that what we had just witnessed shouldn't have been possible. Two adults had been in the yard across the street, moved toward the shed, and vanished in a way that made no sense, leaving no evidence, no footprints, and no trace. We stood there for a while after leaving the shed, trying to process it. My team and I talked through every scenario: hidden tunnels, accomplices, some kind of distraction, even hallucinations. But nothing fit. Not the environment, not the timing, not the physical layout of the property. We had been trained to think critically in situations like this, to question everything, and consider the most likely explanations first. Every single explanation we could come up with failed to account for what had happened. That experience stayed with me long after the call ended. I've been on countless prowler calls, some real, some false, some bizarre, but this one was different. It wasn't threatening in a violent sense, but it was deeply unsettling. There was a calm, deliberate precision to what we witnessed, the gestures, the timing, or the complete and total disappearance, that defied normal logic. It felt like watching something unfold in slow motion, impossible to intervene in or prevent. Even now, thinking back to that night, it sticks with me. It's a rare case where I have no rational explanation, no way to fit it into my understanding of how the world works. It wasn't a prank, it wasn't drugs, it wasn't a mistake. It was something that occurred exactly as described by credible witnesses, and no matter how much I try to reason it away, it refuses to make sense. I've told the story to colleagues and friends, and while some shrug it off as coincidence or misperception, I know what I saw and what the residents saw. There's no easy answer. It changed the way I approach calls like that, the way I think about the limits of observation and perception. It reminded me that sometimes, even in a world we think we understand, things happen that defy explanation. You can train, you can prepare, and you can be ready for almost anything, but there are moments that simply don't fit into what you know. That night was one of them, and I can still feel it in the memory, the impossible disappearance, the calm gestures, the sheer incomprehensibility of it all. I live in Chattanooga, and not far from here, there's a place called Chickamauga Civil War Battlefield. It's a huge, open park filled with history, old monuments, long trails, and wide fields that seem to stretch on forever. During the day, it's actually a really beautiful place. People go there to walk, take pictures, or just enjoy the quiet. But there's also something about it that feels different from a normal park, especially when you start thinking about what happened there a long time ago. When I was 17, a few friends and I decided to go out there and explore. We weren't doing anything serious, just wandering around, talking, and enjoying the freedom of being out somewhere open with no real plan. It was one of those days where you just want to get out of the house and do something a little different. There's a large field toward the back of the park with a tall watchtower standing in the middle of it. That's where we decided to park. The tower itself is pretty noticeable, and the field around it is wide and open, giving you a clear view in almost every direction. From there, you can see tree lines leading into other areas of the park, and there are small paths that cut through the woods, connecting different fields. We started walking across that field, heading toward one of those cut-through paths that led into another, even larger field. The walk itself was calm and easy. The grass moved slightly in the breeze, and everything felt still in a peaceful way. There weren't many people around, and for the most part, it felt like we had the place to ourselves. When we reached the tree line and stepped into the wooded path, the atmosphere changed a little. It wasn't scary, just quieter. The trees blocked out most of the light, and the sounds of the open field faded behind us. The ground was covered in leaves, and every step made a soft crunch. As we were walking along the trail, we suddenly heard something ahead of us. It was the sound of a vehicle, like a truck engine. At first it didn't seem that strange, but the more we thought about it, the less sense it made. I had been to that area before, and I didn't remember there being a road anywhere near that part of the trail. The closest actual road was at the far end of the next field, and it had to be at least 500 yards away. The sound we were hearing felt much closer than that. We slowed down a bit, listening more carefully. The engine sound was steady, not fading or getting louder in a way that suggested distance. It sounded like it was just up ahead, right beyond the trees. Then we saw it. At the end of the trail, just where the trees started to open up into the next field, an old truck passed by. But this wasn't just any truck. It looked unbelievably old, like something from the early 1900s. The headlights weren't built into the body like modern vehicles. They stood out on their own, mounted separately. The windows were perfectly square, and the entire shape of it looked stiff and boxy, nothing like anything you'd expect to see driving around today. For a second, we just stared at it, trying to process what we were seeing. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong in that moment. Then, curiosity kicked in. We started running down the trail, wanting to get a better look at it. It wasn't every day you saw something like that, and we figured maybe there was some kind of event or reenactment happening nearby. That seemed like the most logical explanation at the time. The trail wasn't very long, and we reached the end quickly. But the moment we stepped out into the open area, everything changed. The truck was gone. There was nothing there. We stopped and looked around, expecting to see it somewhere nearby. But the field was completely empty. There were no vehicles, no people, nothing moving at all. Just open land stretching out in every direction. At first, we thought maybe it had driven off quickly, but that didn't make sense. There was nowhere for it to go. The trees around us were too thick for any vehicle to pass through, and the only road was far enough away that we would have seen or heard it heading in that direction. We spread out a little, each of us scanning different parts of the field, hoping to catch even a glimpse of it. But there was nothing. No sound of an engine, no tracks on the ground, no sign that anything had been there at all. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. It wasn't the peaceful quiet we had noticed earlier. This felt different, like the kind of silence that comes after something strange happens and your mind is trying to catch up with it. We started talking about it, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. Each of us described the same thing, the same old design, the same strange details, the same direction it had been moving. It wasn't like one person saw something different or imagined it, but we had all seen it clearly. That's what made it harder to explain. If it had just been me, I probably would have convinced myself it was a trick of the light or my imagination. But all of us saw it, and we all ran toward it at the same time. There was no confusion about what we had witnessed. As we stood there, looking out over that empty field, the history of the place started to creep into my thoughts. That battlefield had seen a lot over the years. Soldiers, camps, movement, and all kinds of activity from a different time. It wasn't hard to imagine that something from the past might still linger there in some way. I'm not someone who usually jumps to supernatural explanations. I like to think there's a logical reason for everything. But in that moment, standing in a place filled with so much history, it felt like we had seen something that didn't belong to our time. If I had to guess, I'd say it might have been something connected to the past. Maybe some kind of leftover impression, like a moment replaying itself. The kind of vehicle we saw matched something you'd expect from the early 1900s, around the time when military units were active in the area. There was even a cavalry unit based not too far from there back then, which only makes it feel a little more possible, even if it still doesn't fully explain anything. We didn't stay much longer after that. The curiosity that made us run toward the truck had been replaced with something else, something quieter and more cautious. We made our way back the same way we came, this time paying more attention to every sound and every movement around us. Nothing else happened that day. No more strange noises, no more sightings. Everything went back to normal, at least on the surface. But that moment stayed with me. Even now, I can still picture that truck clearly, the shape of it, the way it moved, and the way it disappeared without a trace. I've been back to that battlefield since then, and every time I walk those trails, I can't help but think about it. I still don't have a solid explanation for what we saw. Maybe there is one, something simple that we just couldn't figure out at the time. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something tied to the history of that place in a way we don't fully understand. All I know is that for a few seconds, we saw something real, something solid enough to make us run toward it. And then, just as quickly, it was gone, leaving behind nothing but questions. It was late one night, probably around midnight, and I had just finished a long, exhausting day. I had been struggling with depression for a while, and this particular night had been one of the worst bouts I'd had in about a year and a half. My emotions had been running high, a mix of frustration, exhaustion, and sadness, and I had cried myself to sleep the night before. I didn't take medication for my depression, so these episodes could be intense and raw. I remember feeling physically heavy, like the weight of my own mind was pressing down on me, and every small movement felt like an effort. I woke up at exactly 3:34 in the morning. My apartment was quiet, except for my cats, Betty and Varda, who were moving around the bed. Betty was walking around, brushing against the sheets, and Varda was somewhere nearby. The stillness of the night made every small noise seem amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the apartment settling, and the soft padding of cat paws on the floor. I noticed my phone alarm was going off, even though it was set for later in the morning. I used the sleep cycle app, and it seemed like it had glitched. I was frustrated and muttered under my breath, blaming the cats for somehow triggering it or pressing the screen. As I started sitting up and trying to wake my mind fully, I heard a noise that immediately made me tense. My computer in the living room had powered on by itself, and I could hear that familiar little chime it makes. At first, I thought maybe Varda had knocked the mouse while exploring the desk, but then I realized that the monitor had turned on too. My stomach twisted with confusion. How could the cats have possibly done that? I began mumbling to myself in frustration, trying to make sense of it, telling myself, "Damn cats, Betty, stop stomping around. Varda, stop turning things on." I was half laughing and half annoyed, trying to cling to reason in the darkness of the apartment. Then I turned on the bedside lamp. That was when I froze. The cats were lying at the end of the bed, staring intently toward the living room. It wasn't curiosity. They were just watching almost expectantly. My mind raced. Nothing made sense. My heart started to beat faster, the way it does when fear creeps in slowly, building like a wave before crashing. I couldn't understand what was happening. The logical part of my brain was shouting, "It's nothing, calm down." But the visceral fear in my chest didn't listen. And then I heard the front door. The screen door squeaked slightly, followed by the sound of the front doorknob moving. I could hear footsteps on the carpet, slow and deliberate. Every rational part of me wanted to dismiss it, to call it the wind or a creak of the building, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. My pulse quickened, my body went tense. I was suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was, alone in my apartment in the middle of the night. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, trying to make as little noise as possible. I tiptoed toward the hall, trying to peek around the corner to see what was happening. My cats, who had been so alert, suddenly seemed nonchalant, lying down as if nothing unusual was happening. That contrast made the situation feel even stranger. Here I was, convinced that someone or something was in my apartment, while my pets acted as if it was completely normal. I peeked around the corner. The door was closed, the lights were off, my computer was off, the apartment was silent. No one was there. Nothing was moving. And yet, I could still feel that presence, that awareness that I wasn't alone. I stayed there for what felt like minutes, frozen, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to reconcile what I was experiencing with the reality I could see. I couldn't. It was terrifying. The kind of fear that makes your stomach drop, that makes your muscles tense involuntarily, that makes your mind race with all the worst possibilities. Someone had entered my apartment, or at least it felt that way, but I couldn't find anything. Every rational explanation failed. I couldn't understand if I'd been sleepwalking, or if it was a hallucination brought on by extreme stress and depression, but it didn't feel like it. It felt real. The sounds, the movement, the sense of being watched, it all felt too solid, too deliberate to be imaginary. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in my bed, my body still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. Every shadow felt like it might be moving. I kept checking the door and the apartment, trying to convince myself that nothing was there, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, that I had been watched, and that my mind had experienced something that could not be explained. The next day, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had been dreaming while half awake. Maybe the cats had triggered something electronically, or maybe my mind had made up the sounds and the movement. But nothing fit perfectly. No explanation accounted for the combination of all the sensations, the sounds of the door, the sense of presence, the way the cats had been staring, and the computer turning on. It was all too precise, too coherent to be a simple hallucination. Since that night, it hasn't happened again. My apartment is quiet, uneventful and safe, or at least as safe as it can be. But I haven't forgotten it. I remember every detail, every sound, every feeling of helplessness and fear. I still sometimes think back to that night and wonder what really happened, and part of me knows I probably never will know. It's strange to experience fear like that in a place you consider completely safe. Your own home, a place where you are supposed to be secure, suddenly becomes a space of uncertainty and vulnerability. That night left an imprint on me. It taught me how fragile the sense of control can be, how quickly the mind can feel under siege, and how powerless you can feel when logic fails to explain what you experience. I've struggled with depression for years, and that night added another layer of complexity to it. My brain already battles heavy thoughts, and now I had this unexplained experience etched into my memory, a reminder that sometimes reality can feel utterly unstable. Even when nothing harmful happens, the fear and the uncertainty can linger for a long time, coloring your sense of safety and trust in your environment. Looking back, I realize that I can't always find logical explanations for everything that happens. Even though I try to live in a rational, grounded way, sometimes the world throws experiences at you that are outside your understanding. That night was one of those experiences, whether it was a dream, a neurological event, a stress-induced episode, or something completely inexplicable. I know one thing for certain. It felt real, and for that moment, I was not alone in my apartment. I've told therapists, friends, and family about it. They all try to reassure me with explanations, but it doesn't make the memory less vivid, nor does it remove the feeling of fear that came with it. I've learned to live with the memory, to acknowledge it without letting it control my life, and to focus on the things I can explain and manage. But even now, years later, the thought of that night still sends a shiver down my spine, reminding me of just how strange and unpredictable the world can be. If you made it all the way to the end, then you've heard everything, or at least everything people were willing to share. Subscribe if you want more stories like these, because there are always more out there, and some of them are far worse than what you heard tonight.